Hi, I'm Marilyn Emborski, and I'm so honored to be facilitating this session. Our presentation is titled Legacy and Literacy, Unpacking Colonial Influence in Modern Classrooms, and it ties directly into our theme, Bridging Literacy Gaps Through Global Perspectives. Together, we'll explore how historical and colonial legacies continue to shape modern literacy education in both subtle and overt ways, especially in the US and former British African colonies. So for the introduction, I'm going to cover why this session matters. So why does this session matter? We often think about literacy as a current classroom issue, focused on standards, testing, or reading levels. But literacy systems are deeply rooted in historical power structures. In particular, colonial education has left an enduring mark on how literacy is taught, measured, and even valued. By unpacking these patterns, especially in the US and African contexts, we can move towards more inclusive and responsive practices. So these are a few objectives that by the end of today's session, you'll be able to analyze how colonial and historical contexts shape literacy today, compare literacy systems in the US and former British African colonies, identify culturally responsive literacy strategies, reflect using a global and historical lens, and lastly, advocate for more equitable literacy policies and practices. These goals will help guide us through both learning and application today. Colonial education, a global legacy. Colonial systems used education as a tool for power, especially through language. In many colonized areas, English replaced indigenous languages. Education prioritized European values, shaping identity and limiting access to traditional knowledge. Interestingly enough, early US schooling reflected similar trends: standardization, religious instruction, and even conformity through language. Understanding these global patterns help us see the deeper forces shaping our literacy systems today. And this is an excerpt of the American Instructor. It's also colonial evidence of education within the US system. Evolution of the US and public schooling. Zooming in on the US, we see how literacy education emerged from industrial models focused on standardization, efficiency, and workforce readiness. This structure, however, often excluded marginalized voices. While reforms have addressed some gaps, we still see disparities in access, culturally relevant materials, and even representation. Literacy in the US has been more than a skill, it's also been a gatekeeper. So we see ongoing equity challenges and reform efforts today. So for colonial education in African contexts, there are many African countries that were under British rule. Missionary and colonial schools emphasized English literacy and Christian conversion. Success in education meant assimilating into colonial ideals linguistically, culturally, and even socially. After independence, these countries struggled to restructure their systems. Issues like teacher shortages, curriculum access, and language politics still linger. But there's also innovation and resistance worth highlighting. Comparison of literacy systems. So let's take a closer look at this side-by-side comparison of literacy systems in the US and former British African colonies. This chart helps us break down key themes like language, curriculum focus, assessment, and even teacher preparation. We can also see how colonial influence continues to shape each context. So, first let's take a look at language of instruction. In the US, English is overwhelmingly in the US, English is the overwhelmingly majority language. However, this has historically marginalized other home languages, especially among immigrant and indigenous communities. In contrast, many African countries contend with complex multilingual realities. Students often speak an indigenous language at home and are taught English at school. And many take exams in another official or colonial language. This creates real barriers to comprehension and equitable access. Second, let's take a look at curriculum focus. U.S. curriculum is highly standards driven, designed around measurable outcomes, which are often tied to national or state standards. In many former colonies, we still see strong remnants of exam-oriented systems, largely inherited from the British education models. These systems can be rigid and high pressure, sometimes emphasizing rote memorization over critical thinking or contextual learning. Third assessment method. U.S. students are regularly tested through standardized exams, SAT, state reading, benchmarks, and more. In contrast, students in many African nations faced high-stakes national exams with minimal feedback. Often, a single exam can determine access to secondary school or a future career path. The pressure and limitations here are immense. Lastly, teacher preparation. In the U.S., preparation is decentralized and varies widely by state, with access to ongoing professional development depending on region and funding. In African countries, training is often centralized through national programs, but these are frequently undersourced, and teachers may enter classrooms with minimal training, large class sizes, or outdated material. These comparisons aren't just academic, they point to different realities for learners and educators, and they invite us to reflect. What practices have we inherited from colonial or industrial systems, and which ones are we ready to change? Okay, comparison of literacy rates. As you can see, these two maps give us a powerful visual of how literacy outcomes vary across regions, reflecting not only local investment, but also deep-rooted structural influences. Let's start with Africa. On the left, you see the percentage of literacy in various countries. Notice how vast the range is. Countries like Equatorial Guinea, which is 95%, and South Africa, 94%, have relatively high rates of literacy, often tied to stronger infrastructure, urbanization, and educational investment. Meanwhile, countries like Niger, 19%, Chad, 32%, and even the South Sudan, which is 27%, face major challenges due to conflict, poverty, and historic neglect of education systems. Many of these disparities are tied to colonial extraction practices, continued language barriers, and limited access to formal schooling in rural areas. Now let's shift our eyes to the US map. Here, the literacy rates are higher overall, but there are still major disparities by state. States like New Hampshire, 94%, and Minnesota, 93%, are among the highest. On the other hand, states like Mississippi, 81%, Louisiana, 80%, and California, 83%, reflect lower literacy, often correlating with the poverty rates, multilingual populations, or underfunded school systems. Both maps reveal that geography, policy, and history deeply affect access to literacy. So, while we often assume that the US has it figured out, many communities are faced with the same systematic barriers, especially those rooted in racial, linguistic, and socioeconomic inequalities. What I hope you take from this slide is that literacy gaps are global, but they're also patterned. They're not accidental. They reflect centuries of unequal investment in inherited systems, many of which have the power to change. Despite progress, many literacy challenges today still reflect these historic roots. Gaps in achievement persist across racial, linguistic, and socioeconomic lines. Many classrooms lack culturally relevant books or curriculum. Teacher training often overlooks global and historical literacy perspectives. And education policies can lag behind research, preventing meaningful change. I encourage you to consider which of these challenges do you recognize in your own classroom or district. The good news is that we're not stuck in these systems. We can reimagine literacy instruction for today's diverse learners. Some promising shifts include incorporating global case studies to enrich students' learning, embedding student identity, language, and heritage into curriculum, practicing intentional, inclusive, and reflective teaching every day. You might start with bilingual books, family storytelling events, or inviting students to write about their culture and traditions. Every small move builds a more just and inclusive learning environment. So these are just some ideas if you would like to integrate these questions into your own teaching practice or even classroom to kind of help you with your own teaching practice. And so some of these questions could include: where do your literacy practices originate, from local, national, or international influence? You could even do a breakout activity that compares practices with US versus African or another country's literacy. And then a reflection prompt could be: what global perspectives could enhance your teaching approach? Action planning. Let's now move forward to action. Using this format: context, insight, strategy, next step, I invite you to draft one or two practical ideas to bring a global or historical lens to your literacy instruction. I also invite you to think about your students, school, community, or even curriculum. Then, if possible, share this with someone nearby. Often, that conversation brings even more clarity and collaboration. Supplemental materials. To support continued learning, I've pulled together 3 sets of resources. First, a quick reference table summarizing instruction, curriculum, assessment, and policy differences across US and African contexts. Second is a culturally responsive literacy toolkit. Within this toolkit, there's a curated book list for children and YA readers. There's sample lesson plans focused on identity and heritage, a family literacy night planning guide, strategies for incorporating oral history and storytelling, and lastly, a cultural relevant checklist for classroom texts. And then lastly, I included an annotated bibliography for further reading, and you'll see some further examples in the next slides. So again, this is the reference table summarizing instruction, curriculum, assessment, as well as policy differences across the US and African contexts. I'll let you take a look at this for a minute. And then this is the culturally responsive toolkit. As mentioned earlier, I included the list of what is within the toolkit. And then at the bottom of the slide, you'll see sample books, which include Mama Panya's Pancakes, which is originated in Kenya, and it focuses on a global economy as well as community. The next book is Thank You Omu, which is a Nigerian American book, and the theme is generosity in food. The next one is We Are Protectors, which is an indigenous story. And lastly, the book I included was The Patchwork Path, which is an American or African American Underground Railroad narrative. And then this is the annotated bibliography. I listed about 5 of these, and I hope this sparks your interest, and if you continue to learn more about this topic, you can further your reading on texts such as a foundational work on culturally responsive pedagogy, and it focuses on its connection to equity and identity. Second, a deep dive into colonial influence on African education and identity formation. The next one explores how national histories shape critical literacy framework. The next one, you can see number 4 is up-to-date statistics and policy trends across former colonies and global education systems. And lastly, number 5 advocates for educational approach to going beyond inclusion, that go beyond inclusion to cultural sustainability. So before we close, I would like to ask the question, how has today's session shifted your perspective or approach? I think this can be an important question for all of us educators, whether we're learning about this topic or many others, to kind of correlate what we've learned into our own teaching context to not only grow as teachers, but also grow as people and ultimately help our students grow into their own self-determined, independent learners. So this is a historical timeline of colonial education policies. As you can see, the heading is tracing the roots. Below you'll see a timeline of colonial education influence. So this timeline highlights key moments in the evolution of education under British colonial rule. You'll notice how missionary education and English literacy were tools for control, often sidelining indigenous knowledge and languages. Many post-colonial systems still reflect these structures, especially in assessment, curriculum, and language policy. So what can we do now? This is a call to action. Ultimately, you might be wondering, where do we go from here? These action points offer a starting place for transforming literacy practices. Whether you're a teacher, a coach, or a policy advocate, you can play a role in building systems that honor all learners' backgrounds. True legacy empowerment comes when we recognize and challenge these legacies that shape our classrooms. I invite you now to pause and reflect. This closing visual reminds us that literacy is not just a classroom skill, it's identity shaping. It's not just about reading and writing, it's about those whose voices are amplified and whose stories are missing. Whether you're teaching in Buffalo or Botswana, literacy can either erase or elevate. Let's commit to telling fuller, more truthful stories and validate identity, honor heritage, and build justice into our daily teaching. So as you can see on this slide, there's a background image. It's a split screen showing two classrooms, one from rural Africa and one from the modern US classroom. I hope this is a good visual for you to kind of understand the two different settings and in which students are learning their literacy. And I know it was a helpful tool for me to kind of reflect and just kind of understand two different worlds. And then also on this slide, you'll see a quote, "Legacy matters. Literacy is not neutral. Every learner's story belongs." So whether students are in rural Africa or in the States, it's important for us to kind of understand where our students are coming from and what knowledge they take into our classroom. Before we move forward, I'd like to share a brief video clip that speaks to the heart of this session, why storytelling matters. This clip highlights the deep connection between narrative and identity. Whether through oral traditions, family history, or community voices, stories teach us where we come from and give us the language to express who we are. In many colonized contexts, especially across Africa, and even in indigenous communities in the US, storytelling was a primary mode of education, history keeping, and cultural preservation. But colonial systems often erased or devalued these practices, replacing them with Eurocentric texts and histories. Restoring storytelling in literacy instruction isn't just about cultural enrichment, it's about healing, resistance, and even restoring voices. It's how students learn they're not just passive recipients of knowledge, but creators of it. And here's an African proverb that we can be reflecting on as I start this video. It says, "Until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter."
And so, as educators, we get to not just impart knowledge, but facilitate knowledge. Stories that we listen to need to come from a variety of sources. Because in a story, your author is acting a little bit like an elder. He's teaching you storytelling attorneys as he control and I teach the students of the human condition as you're going through the English content of the elements that the students need to pick up on is what does it mean to be human being. So through stories, the students are able to make those achieve certification. And the first steps are set allows for students to experiment, which considers forms to vocabulary of questions for identifying aspects of content and characters of a story. These are especially relevant as our child is encouraged to find, create, and format or shift in programming understanding perceptions. We're recognizing something very significant about the human condition, and that is that no matter what culture we're from, there's commonalities that come out when we tell our stories. I think that when it's okay to learn who you are, because before you learn who you are, the thing that you learn is only like I would say next to you feel like we learned about it like in real time. So it's like a different like tablet or a lot of more about other cultures for stories, and I like to like a lot of different things. Stories teach because they give you a perspective and give you not just hearing the facts, but hearing the idea of people, emotions, and this. Here's what this person feels they felt. Developing that's what matters too. So it's not simplistic in the classroom, just focusing on information. It is for the teacher developing interactions. With stories, it develops fiction. It's telling truths about the place where are from. If what like if someone like understood who have before that you know it's not paid for someone else paid because I've never before had a lot of stuff but then like having to board like so that's cool. I like that. Thomas came I go back to him and basically he said as I said before the truth of adult stories is found solving the ground. And he said, take the story from things like yours, do it what you will, tell it to your friends, turn it into a television movie for kids, but then say in years to come that you have lived your life differently if only you have heard the story. You've heard it now.
So I hope that was a helpful video to kind of help us to understand why it's so important to have storytelling within your literacy classroom to help us better understand where our students are coming from and who they are and how they learn best. Yeah, it also helps us kind of have that comparison of our students and how we can better teach them and help them grow. Yeah. So, as we move on to the next slide, this one is focusing on whose story we're telling, but based off of an educator's voice, ground level perspectives. So I encourage us to take a moment to hear from other educators, real voices from classrooms. So if you take a look at these quotes, you may notice that these teachers reflect what many of us feel, that our materials, standards, and even teaching expectations often carry colonial legacies, whether intentional or not. So one of the quotes mentions, we still rely on a reading canon that doesn't reflect our students' worlds. Instructional materials rarely show African authors unless it's colonial context. And we've inherited a system, but that means we can also reshape it. This is hard work. It takes time to notice, and even more courage to change, but it's doable. And it begins with conversations like this one, as well as just like we saw in the video, integrating our students' stories and storytelling into the classroom for us to better understand and make a change within our classroom. Okay, so when reflecting on student experience and focusing on literacy on the ground, we can realize that students notice when curriculum doesn't reflect them. Language loss, cultural disconnect, and internalized feelings of inferiority often stem from systems designed without them in mind. When we ignore student identity in literacy instruction, we miss the chance to empower them. But when we center their voices through literacy, language, and storytelling, we build confidence, connection, as well as critical thinking skills. This is how we turn literacy into liberation. Personal reflection. I invite you to do some inward reflection. In your classroom, your school, your curriculum, these are some questions I urge you to think about. Where might you notice colonial patterns? Are there materials that privileged one language, culture, or worldview? Are some students expected to assimilate more than others? You don't have to overhaul everything overnight, but if you start small, rethink one unit, add one global author, welcome one language, you can make all the difference. Every thoughtful shift plants seeds of equity as well as inclusion. Thanks for listening. Thank you all so much for being here and for engaging with this important conversation. Whether you came in with experience on this topic or this was a new lens for you, I truly appreciate your openness and reflection. Colonial legacies in education can feel like a heavy topic, but there's also an important opportunity for us as educators to make intentional and liberating choices for our students. Again, I urge us to continue the work of centering diverse voices, challenging inherited systems, and building more just, inclusive literacy practices together. The change may not happen overnight, but it begins with awareness, dialogue, and brave action, just like what we've started here today. If you have any questions, thoughts, or would like to continue this conversation, I'd love to connect with you at a later time. Thank you again for your presence and for the work you do every day to shape the next generation of readers, thinkers, and leaders. Take care and have a wonderful rest of your day.